addressing or that we were aware of that we'll need to address over the next year or two. And effectively, I would suggest that the board's business plan and work plan really derive from these future activities in terms of either monitoring the projects that the fund is undertaking at the moment, or satisfying itself that some of the things that we've identified are being addressed or in our plan. So page 69 sets out those items. The top part of that are just the four functions within the fund, and then underneath that there are a number of either legislative changes or projects that we are dealing with, and the completion dates that we have in mind for those. So some are quite close, and others are further away.
Yeah, to take the fact that it's not on the list, is there no work to be done on the cost column and cap?
There is something there on this. It's around reports for pension fund transactions regards cost control calculations.
I'm sorry, I missed that.
But we are working off that, working with Dan for the readings around splitting amounts, benefit approvals for pre-approved courses, so we can supply the information for that in 2019.
I should say that we have a much more detailed business plan with a lot more projects and activities on. These, in a sense, are the principal activities, but you're quite right, there are a number of other things going on. More routine things around, contracts that need to be retendered. We've got quite a few of those. And other more internal, almost business as usual projects, but nonetheless, we have them in our business plan because we need to make sure they're appropriately resourced, make sure we've identified any risks associated with them. So this is just some of the larger and perhaps the more legislative related items for us to deal with. But it's the matter you refer to actually more detail involved than it might appear on the surface.
I suppose we haven't got any idea to try how many of the reviews going to be going. A couple of weeks to go.
It's going to Pensions Committee in March. Right. So, 21st of March, so it's going in a week's time.
Right. Watch this space.
Yeah, so we have the draft funding strategy statements on this agenda.
Yeah.
Yes, so the one. Well, in fact, the agenda's in the public domain, so it's being published.
Peter, at the bottom of page 69 you talk here about the investment strategy and performance, and I'm aware from other conversations we've had that you are presently reviewing the investment strategy. In terms of reference to this board say that it is not our function to question the investment strategy of the Merseyside pension, which is absolutely correct because we're not a decision-making body, but in terms of reference to specifically say that we are concerned with the processes that have been followed in determining investment decisions. So could I therefore ask that at the autumn meeting, I think at the autumn meeting would probably be the appropriate one, you could bring a report specifically to this board which seeks to demonstrate to us the process that's been followed in reviewing the investment strategy, because we're talking about £7 billion worth of assets here. So if you can bring us a paper here, I'm not talking a long paper, 3 pages or something, which explains the process that has been gone through so that the investment strategy that is approved by the Pensions Committee in due course, really to show how that has been done. If you could do that, I think that is something which we really should be doing, it's specifically mentioned in the term of reference.
Certainly, I can make sure that's included in the work plan.
Yvonne, draft funding strategy statement. Back to the true evaluation.
Sorry, the ISS comes in before.
Oh, sorry, the ISS, sorry. ISS, please. Sorry.
No, and again, this is actually guidance on the investment strategy statement. We are actually taking our formal investment strategy statement to committee in a week's time, but it's just partly the way that dates have fallen on this occasion. This came out of the change to investment regulations in November last year. The fund's statement of investment principles has been replaced by an investment strategy statement, and effectively the guidance is guidance issued by DCLG in relation to the detail of the investment strategy statement. The regulations say that we have to have regard to guidance issued by the Secretary of State. So effectively this guidance is the guidance issued by the Secretary of State to which we have to have regard in terms of developing our investment strategy statement. Without going into too much detail, turning to page 75, there's a requirement for the administering authority to formulate an investment strategy, and as it says, it must be in accordance with the guidance issued by the Secretary of State. Under 2.2, it just sets out the requirements within the investment regulations in terms of investing in a wide variety of investments, the requirement to assess the suitability of the investments, the authority's approach to risk and ways in which risk is to be measured and managed. Obviously one of the new items is the authority's approach to pooling investments. And another change has been in relation to both social, environmental and corporate governance considerations and exercise of voting rights that it's been made more explicit in the current investment regulations. Previously it was put much more in an optional way. An authority had to publish its policy if it had one, whereas now the investment regulations are really forcing authorities to think more carefully about their policy and how it's implemented. It's something that we have always taken seriously as a pension fund. We've had responsible investment policies in place for a number of years. We were one of the founding members of the Local Authority Pension Fund Forum, which was established 25 years ago. So, as a pension fund, we've always taken this area seriously, and we're pleased really that it's had a higher profile in the investment regulations. You may be aware that there's been a degree of concern expressed in some quarters that the government's guidance sort of indicates that any exclusion policies used by pension funds should be consistent with the Foreign Office, and effectively that's around making sure that local authorities are consistent with that, that boycotts and so on aren't just implemented without regard to national policy. As I say, that's been an area of discussion and disagreement, but effectively that's what the guidance says about it. Clearly in relation to pooling investments. And then the other area that's new is that directions by the Secretary of State, that's set out under section 3, but the government felt because we were moving to a prudential regime that gave more flexibility to administering authorities in how they implement their investment strategy, it was right that the Secretary of State has scope to intervene if he feels that local authorities aren't having regard to the guidance that is issued. Again, that's been an area of concern and debate. My personal view is that that's been overdone. It's quite clear that there's quite a long lead-in to any intervention by the Secretary of State, involving writing to administering authority, listening, consulting with other experts. It'd also be subject to judicial review, so I think it's something that's unlikely to be a step unlikely to be taken by the Secretary of State, but clearly it's there in the investment regulations and is something that we need to be aware of. Others may wish to comment on that or otherwise. But I think that covers the main areas of the investment strategy statement, and so the next pension board will bring the formal document to the board.
Any questions or comments? I mean, I would agree with would agree with the direction by Secretary of State. If you read the lines, it's very clear that intervention would be only after a due process, and you'd have to flagrantly disregard the regulations for it to happen, and it's a reserve power. And other Secretary of States have reserve power in terms of social services and education, which are only used in extremis, and I think it's the same here. And the one area I can see being used is frauding, but I don't think that this fund needs to worry about that, because you're quite clearly progressing in that code. But I think that is possibly the one or two funds around the country who I understand are still struggling with the concept. And that may be an encouragement for them not to struggle so much. Shall we move on?
Actually, before we do, if I could just refer you to 2.11 in the report. This is actually another area of modest change in the investment regulations, and something I might well look to the board for perhaps some guidance on. So clearly the regulations continue to indicate that the pursuit of financial return is the predominant concern, and that fiduciary responsibility remains unchanged. But it does go on to say, although they may take purely non-financial considerations into account, and again that's something we do. If we're evaluating two investments that have similar returns, and one has either more environmental benefits or social or governance benefits than the other, that will swing the balance. But it then goes on to say we can do that, providing it would not involve significant risk of financial detriment to the scheme. So effectively, it's opening the way for the fund to invest, for example, in the local area for a lower return, provided that's not seen as material. But then the other criteria is, and where they have good reason to believe that scheme members would support their decision. And again, it's around assessing the thoughts of scheme members. Particularly with a larger fund, that's potentially more difficult for us to do. And our view at the moment is that members' views are achieved through the Pensions Committee. The Pensions Committee has elected members who are there to represent all stakeholders. That includes employers, that includes employees, it includes taxpayers, it includes everyone involved in the pension fund. We also have member representatives. Again, we feel that's a good forum for member views to be reflected. I'm just thinking whether there are other things that we should be doing. Clearly there have been suggestions that we should ballot members and so on and so forth, but at the moment my view is that the governance measures we have in place are wide-ranging and do suitably capture member views on things. But it might be something that in future I ask the pension board may consider thought on that point, or a number of those points captured in that detail.
I think that would be useful, because I think we've got a wider member representation. We've also got employers who are not district council strongly represented here, because district council have only got one level of four. I'm not a member of this fund, so you might say that I haven't got a view, but I suppose give an advisory view. When it comes to local investment and social impact investment, of course, which also the regulations encourage. Social impact investing is where you invest in something that has a social consequence. For example, another fund that I'm involved in London is investing in a particular fund where they are funding businesses which are trying to develop dementia services, or are trying to provide housing in Glasgow, where there's severe housing issues, but through the private sector, through a sort of social impact approach. When you look at either locally or that, I would have thought that there's always the issue about the investment return, and while you don't have overall within the fund to meet the actuary's investment return expectations, I would have thought that on these sort of things, so long as it meets the actuary's return expectations, which aren't always necessarily ultra high, that you've got a very good reasonable saying that if somebody meets the active investment return requirements, and you can verify they do, there is then a very good case of saying that is a potential investment. So if you were to come through with something which is local or something which is impact, which meets the actuary's expectations, I would have thought there's a prima facie case for considering it. Now, I don't know, because you're the head of the fund, I'm just giving you a view as the independent chair, whether that's something which, members here might want to consider or think about. I don't know if you think that's appropriate advice or not. I'm not saying it's the, the make or break, but I think it is a guide. Actually said, I expect the fund to make this as its, return over the next 3 years. And if the investment comes to you with that sort of return, and it is social impact, it would at least pass one clear barrier, which it would be difficult for people to argue against, i.e. the investment return value. Because I think it's below that return, there could be an argument. Now, it doesn't mean it's a definitive argument against it, because sometimes funds do invest in investments below that return for particular reasons. But I think it would weaken the case, particularly if someone was not particularly in favour of local investment or social impact. If it's above that actuary's expectation, which then the FSS and the investment strategy standards are based on, I think it does strengthen the argument. I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
I think that would be a very good starting point. Clearly, returns have to be related to risk, so it always comes down to how much risk we're taking, how much return we should be looking for. But I think that's a very sensible place to start. If it clears one hurdle, then we can start looking at the other items and making a judgment of those points of view. But I do see the pension board as representing member views as well. You're here to assist the administrative authority, but you're here as another point of view. So I'm really just putting it on the table for a thought for the future.
I think one of the factors is actually reputational risk. So if taking to some extent a ridiculous example, but if there was a local tobacco factory, we might not invest in that because of obviously the reputational risk of that, although it does have a local interest. So I think there's the consideration of local benefits, but also the reputational risk with our members and with wider stakeholders and with the local community.
No, I think that's a very good example. Yes, we have been approached with a number of investments. Without saying too much, one of the proposals we received was effectively around what seemed to be an online pawnbroker. And we just took the view that, I say, reputationally relative to the returns that they were offering to pay us, the returns were above the actuarial hurdle, but so it wasn't just down to reputation. But clearly, that was one where we felt reputationally we didn't really want to be involved in it when there were other investments that would provide us with a better return. But I won't get into too much detail because obviously we get a lot of interesting proposals, but maybe quite right, reputation is important to us.
I do wonder, Peter, and you're right, because the regulations do particularly talk about this, whether these scheme members have good reason to believe, or believe good reason to believe scheme members would be in favour of this. I mean, the members of this board, I've got 38 members who are, either director members or also director members as well, because they are members, but representing employers. Because you've got 8 people who are probably, better informed, actually, and you can argue, I think from your point of view, tell me again how you're wrong here, that if you've got a social impact investment or local investments, which you're considering with the pension scheme, which of course has the absolute authority over this matter, and we have no authority whatsoever. But you have this issue about where you believe you might have good reason to believe the members are content. This would provide, I think, you with clear evidence of that, or otherwise, because the members of this board have that statutory requirement to do training. We can look to the training that's been done. There's been an awful lot of training, where the 3-day events, etc., other training that's been undertaken. So you can say that, and the experience actually, because you were very lucky when you recruited the 8 members here, that you picked up 8 members who've got a lot of knowledge, a lot more than I think a lot of other pension boards around the country. There were some very good people elsewhere, but I think some had real problems in finding people with knowledge. So So you've got 8 members or 7 members at the moment with knowledge. I think if you were to have an investment of that sort that was to be brought here, you know, and was obviously in closed session, a discussion about that, you could then use that as a sounding board, you know, which may give you a positive or a negative view, obviously, but it would be evidence, I think, to satisfy the regulation and any, you know, challenge that might come from the reporter subsequently. So personally, I think it would be a very good way of doing it, because it is, I think, also an informed comment, because again, and you can do this in great detail, you know, give access to the regulations and the statutory guidance of September 2016, which says about, you know, investments, yeah, the investment strategy and statutory guidance. I mean, the members here have read that and understand it. I think you can then argue you've got an informed view from members and from an official body as well. So yes, I think you've got to, you know, if you want to pursue that as a director of fund, I think that would be a good idea. I mean, board members content with that.
The social impact bonds are coming really popular now for funding, and there's loads of ways you can bid in for funds now to support. I mean, I work in adult social care, so homeless, drug addiction, things like that, you know, to try and get those cohorts. I think the problem is evidencing the return and the saving, you know, and it's obviously the long investment, long-term investment as well, but I definitely think it's something, you know, particularly in the local area, that could work.
I mean, the evidence of the investment in returns, obviously, because we don't know about preaching these stuff, they have to be content that the risk-adjusted returns are, in their opinion, realistic. And, you know, at a point where they had an investment they thought was, you know, past the investment test, that might have a slightly lower level than they might otherwise, then they could bring it in. I mean, that's the way around it. If you bring something here which you had tested robustly, it met the investment criteria so far as you were concerned, whatever you said, but it might be a little bit lower than perhaps, you know, another investment which didn't have a social impact or a local impact, and then you bring it in. But they are out there, John, you're right. I mean, they're definitely out there.
Of your interest, we're invested in a couple of things. We're certainly invested in a fund that's backing the Greater Merseyside Connections service, so we have some money in that. Another investment we have is built effectively a sort of pharmacy hub in Birkenhead. So there's a fund that do a lot of innovative things. They effectively look at opportunities of making commercial investments in underserved areas of the market. So, for example, they've set up a low-cost hotel chain. It effectively is a lower-cost Premier Inn, for want of a better description, but it, you know, provides a decent level of service, it provides local employment, and it's in areas of cities that have been underserved up till now. They set up a chain of gyms, again in more deprived areas with lower-cost membership. That's all around, you know, providing health and well-being, providing employment, you know, with the associated benefits. And again, you know, they've actually sold it on to another gym chain because it's been so successful. So they're very good at identifying those kind of opportunities, you know, having a commercial angle to them, but actually doing things that have a social good as well. So, you know, we've been very pleased with that particular organisation, and, you know, they tend to raise more funds and we tend to continue on those sorts of things. But, yeah.
I was just going to ask around that. Have you got any like stats of the number of investments that you do that are locally, or, you know, the social impact? And do you look at that on like an annual basis and do you have targets, or do you tend to keep it a bit more loose?
We don't have targets because, dare I say, you know, like the overseas aid, you know, if you have a target, people are concerned that you just spend money to achieve your target. But we're looking to increase, you know, one of the items in our business plan is around more information on our website around responsible investments. We are aware of those investments we have. Measuring the impact, as Donna says, is more challenging, but there's some very good progress being made in how you measure the progress. So it's a fuzzy way of saying it's something we're working on, and we hope to have more information in the future.
Sorry, one of the things which we targeted on from the regional over Retired Members Committee is to sort of look at aspects of aftercare service from NHS, respite care, elderly people's care homes, etc. Because of the bed blocking and treatments being delayed, etc. Would the fund be keen on, say, providing respite care homes, elderly persons care homes? I mean, I know on Wirral we haven't got any council owned homes now, so it all depends on private homes, which in some cases can cost a heck of a lot of money, up to £2,000 per person per week. So a lot of people are making a lot of money out of these care homes privately, when we could be running them locally at a cheaper cost, providing employment for people within the community.
Short answer is yes.
But I've got a motion going to Commissioners' Conference to that effect. Well, would that be effectively pool funding, or would that effectively be just local investment within the fund?
For the immediate future, it would be local investments. Longer term, it might be from the pool.
I shall have to adjust that then. That motion accordingly. Thank you.
Liverpool proposes build 3 pubs, exactly what you're saying there, Raven centres to put people out of
Can you contact that? Because we need to be finding evidence for this. As I say, it came up as a major factor. I've got the next meeting's in April, where we're hoping to sort of move forward and start putting some stuff through at a national level of conference in October.
I mean, probably the reality is, Liverpool can borrow money through the Public Works Loan Board more cheaply than the pension fund will be able to lend it to them, because we have this actuarial return that we need to make. But yes, you're right, there are commercial organisations that if we could almost stand in their shoes, we could make decent returns, local authorities save money, and it would seem to be a win-win situation.
Thank you.
For the strategy statement, move on.
We took the draft management strategy statement to committee in November for noticing and received delegated authority for officers to finalise the strategy prior to forming approval in March. Finalised strategy will be going into committee, as Lisa said, next Tuesday. There's a draft of the FSS as an appendix to the report. The fund, we did arrange a number of employer forums to encourage engagement to the consultation on the FSS, and we shared their results with individual employers to inform their comments on the strategy. I know a number of board members did attend the consultations, and they will note that the event was really busy. We had one-to-ones with the employers to discuss their provisional numbers and explain the reasons for changes in the funding positions. The key changes to the funds and strategy from 2013 are really that there's a link now to the discount rate to expected investment returns above inflation, as opposed to gilt years as in the past. And this is looking to reduce the volatility in the funding position and provide more stable value liabilities going forward. The CPI model which we're now adopting is more transparent. Its funding is more closely aligned with the investment performance that we're looking to achieve. We've also removed the allowance that 10% of members will go into the 50/50 scheme that didn't third seat. And also we've introduced different investment strategies known as buckets. You can note on page 86 that the yearly total fund results were 86%, and the future savings rate was 15.1%. Over the last few months, after taking into account latest short-term pay selections from employers, the funding position has reduced from 86 to around 84.8%, and the future savings rate has increased to 15.4%. That takes into account the closed employers and also the employer options around what they're doing around future saves and phasing, so that's what the rate up a little bit. I'm happy to take any questions on the funding strategy or explain anything that you need to. Quite a long document, and it has a significant revamp from the 2013 document that we had, and it includes all our integrated policies, and so it's more transparent for employers to know what we're doing around funding, especially around terminations. So I'm happy to answer any questions around anything that you've got before. Anything that was anything.
Thanks, John. Page 110, second paragraph, ill health retirement. increasingly we are seeing employers mitigate the number of ill health retirements by employing HR, occupational health, preventative measures. What are they reading on?
What I've asked, obviously I've been looking at the FSS over the last few months. I've asked them to change the wording on that to say that we're making sure that that employers have the procedures in line obviously with the regulations. But I think I don't believe employers are taking their own HR operations to make sure that that they're offering people things around gyms and to keep healthy. But I think what we're trying to say there is that employers we're making sure that employers are aware of what the regulations are or what procedures are, so they're tightened up on them.
Okay.
But what we are doing is from this valuation, we're initiating ill health insurance for smaller employers, in particular for community admission bodies, academies and some new designated bodies, because although ill healths are quite rare, and ill health can be really costly and can have a huge impact on a small employer's funding position. So what we've decided to do through consultation, we've had a number of employers coming back to us and saying that they will be interested in us introducing an ill health insurance arrangement, which is going to be like a captive insurance arrangement for all the smaller employers, and they'll pay a premium into within the contribution rate, which is 1% for this valuation. And what happens is that premium will go into a separate fund, which will be tracked over the valuation period and basically pay for any ill health payments, any ill health retirement for people in that captive arrangement. So it won't have an direct impact on their funding levels. There's about 15% of our employers in the captive insurance arrangement, but actually it is only in relation to 9% of the liability. So although a lot of employers are in there, it's only 9%
Because
of
of
the
the smaller
liability.
employers.
Smaller employers.
Yeah.
So we're not putting a large account for them there because they have a bigger payroll and they're able to take the knocks around the ill
Yeah,
health.
statistically it's not
Yeah.
significant. Thanks.
Chair, just a bugbear of mine. On page 107, once again, the pie chart is actually meaningless. It's not got any colour output on it. Perhaps we're going to do that sort of thing in future. A bar chart would be a little bit more informative. Either that or produce a colour page for that particular page and work out. But yeah, we used to get involved with the same with the accounts when I worked, and that was one of my big bugbears, that because it's meaningless as it stands, as it were.
Be better if it was in colour.
In colour or a bar chart would probably suffice.
Can I carry on from that one? The type face colour here is not black, it's like a grey colour. And I think a black would make it more legible. Yeah.
Grey instead of black.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
maybe.
Especially when you get old like me.
Yes, I think in fairness, obviously the proper document is in colour.
Right, yeah,
And
it's just the print there.
but you're quite right, it's not so easy.
So the document on the website will be in colour.
It is.
Which is perhaps why we should accelerate our use of tablet devices. Never actually in colour and no actual cost.
If you just want me to expand on that, what we're doing because we're changing, because of this valuation, the funding level, as you say, is improved. Rate was 76% after 2013 valuation, has gone up to 85% really, and deficits have reduced medium bucket, which is more exposure is reduced from growth assets down to more defensive assets. And rather than being 80-20, we're going to be looking for 65 in growth and 65% in growth, 35% in defensive assets. What that will basically do, it will protect against some of the downside risks. So we're going to be looking at, we've done covenant reviews and we've placed all employers with certain buckets, the higher risk, medium risk and the low risk buckets. And depending on the strength of the property, funds and position, depends where you get them. So the middle risk bucket, we're going to be having meetings with employees in the certain buckets. We've had meetings, Robin attended one yesterday with the colleges. Next week we're having a meeting with employees we're saying that it might be advantageous for them to go into the middle risk bucket. We're basically saying we're putting it in there, but we'll have discussions with you if you don't want to go in that middle risk bucket. But basically what will happen there, your contribution rate will stay the same when you're in the risk bucket, but your returns could potentially be lower because you're in the 65% growth assets. It could be lower, but what you're actually protecting against there is the downside risk of your deficit increasing the next valuation. And then what we've got is a lower risk bucket, which is designed to have lower risk income generating assets in there, which is designed to be cash flow matching, and the discount rate will be just a little bit above CPI. And what we're looking to do there is put all our orphan liabilities in there for people who've exited the funds, so we'll put them into there, or anybody who's thinking about exiting the funds, it may be a more appropriate strategy for them, or also for people who want to lock down risk if they're in a good funds position, in like 90%, 100% funds, if you might want to lock down the risk there at the cost of paying probably a higher contribution rate, but you've got more certainty that your funds position isn't going to go from one place to the next valuation. So that's what we're doing. We're looking to implement these buckets from April 17, and as I said, we're having ongoing discussions with employers.
Depending on what bucket you're in, you know, in 3 years' time when you do the reevaluation, would certain buckets increase more than others in terms of their employer contributions?
Yes, because if you're in it depends. If you're in the medium risk bucket and your investments haven't retained as much as you would have thought, but because you're more positioned to the defensive, it could be that your contribution rate, you haven't had that much downside, so your contribution rate could be more stable, or it could be that at the moment the fund's retaining really well over the last 12 months, so you're giving up that upside, so your deficit could be a bit higher because you're not getting the increased returns. Then it does impact on the contribution rates in 3 years' time, depending on how them assets have performed over the 3-year period.
Any more questions or observations?
Page 120 on the employer deficit recovery plan, it mentions contingent assets. Have we actually accepted any contingent assets from any employer?
We've got lots of, as the last 10 years we've been quite on the front foot of taking assets, yeah. We've got lots of bonds in place, we've got assets against employers' bank accounts, we've got a few property charges, so yes we have.
Right.
And we have been doing that for 10 years.
And they're quite popular with their employers.
Well, to be honest, when employers come in, we don't let them in unless they provide us with some kind of security now.
Right.
Historic old community charity bodies that came in a long time ago, we haven't got these guarantees, but what we do, we target a higher funding position, funding level, so we apply a risk premium on top of their contribution rate, so they have to fund 120% rather than 100%. So we have got measures in place, gone through our whole risk management, looked at all the buckets, looked at the covenants and decided, what we couldn't previously have based on what security they've given us.
investments directive,
Yes, sorry, this is a great title, but it's on the agenda just because it is a matter of concern to us. If you could just turn to page 135, it's probably the simplest. I won't go into it in huge detail, but effectively there was a MIFID 1, we're now on to MIFID 2, and various elements of MIFID 2 is being consulted on as we speak. As I say, under 1.2, a major and contentious element of the proposals is for the reclassification of local authorities as retail investors, which fundamentally changes the way in which we can conduct investment business with our counterparties. As I say under 2.1, the intention is obviously to provide protection to investors. The reason that the directive has been passed is that a number of local authorities in Italy entered into sort of local borrowing transactions that involved some hedging, which didn't work out very well. I think there's been some problems in France as well. So the EU has effectively taken the view that all local authorities should be deemed to be retail investors. The problem for us is twofold, really. One is that there are certain investments that are only marketed to professional investors. We've always been deemed to be professional investors, so that means that those investments will no longer be available to us. The workaround is that you can opt up to be a professional investor. Two issues. One is not all counterparties have arrangements in place to opt investors up. If you're used to selling to professional investors, you don't have the arrangements or the compliance in place in order to make that assessment that a retail investor can become a professional investor. And the other issue with it is existing relationships and what the implications are for existing relationships where we have investments as professional investors that will be retail in future. The criteria that the FCA has set for opting up, there are two dimensions to it. One is qualitative, the other is quantitative, and again, they're very unhelpful. There are very few local authorities and local authority funds that will fulfil those criteria as they're written. We're probably one of the few funds that will, but even so I wouldn't be 100% confident on that. Two issues for local authorities. One is treasury management, that this will affect treasury management at local authorities. In a sense, that's not a concern for us. It affects a few number of local authorities, as the Chair said, 88 local authorities that have LGPS funds. So we are working very closely with the FCA to try and get them to